G'day, legends. I hope that you're having a fantastic Monday, a fantastic start to the week, and the second video of the day. So if you're powering through both and you're with me, thank you. And the safari suit is back out. It has been a little while, but don't worry. I'm basically in my jocks below all of this. Anyway, we have a lot to go over today. We need to have a look at the maps. We'll look at where things are changing. We need to talk about the F-16s, the fighter aircraft coming into Ukraine, long promised as a game changer, and what the reality will be on the ground from experts and some reporting as well, given the numbers and giving the complications there too. We'll talk about Zelensky talking again at this messaging of November peace and not seeing a desperate mobilization that needed to happen months ago. Well, I don't know. I think we may be heading towards something that is maybe a bit unexpected. But we also need to talk about an article that's come out from the Washington Post speaking about that Russia is improving tactics on the front line and what they're using as far as a very, quote, clever tactic. Now, interestingly, I'm going to line this up with the doctrine of attritional warfare that you and I have been speaking about for 6 or 7 months, and see the, I don't want to say Venn diagram, but see how it's overlapping with this and where it lines up, as well as with an interview that we did recently, but it was anonymous through myself, about where this lines up as well. So let's do that. And we'll also, in this talk about NATO versus Soviet doctrine in protracted attritional war, and which one will be victorious, as we know that Ukraine is using a bit of a hybrid NATO, and Russia, of course, is that Soviet doctrine. So again, let's jump into it. Let's then rock and roll. So Washington Post then had this up today. Russia adapting tactics, advances in Donetsk, and takes more Ukrainian land. And we have seen this year. It has just been Russian advance after Russian advance, just chipping away. Many are saying, like we named our title yesterday, but they're advancing too slowly. But this is, we'll speak about, an attritional war. Alexander, 30-year-old, a battalion commander in the 47th Brigade, fighting near Osharetny, said that Ukrainian forces are struggling and that Putin's prize increasingly seems within Russia's reach. He says the strategy is clever. You can try to concentrate the strength of your enemy in one direction and then distract them at another. Alexander, whose call sign is Genius, and who is being identified only by first name, is keeping with Ukrainian military protocol. So saying that their strategy is you try and concentrate your enemy's strength somewhere and then you distract them in another area. Their first objective is to destroy us. The second is to push us so they can get more leverage for peace talks and get more from us. They are almost at the point of capturing the Donetsk region. Now, let's step across to then attritional warfare doctrine. Now, mass fires then forces deep maneuver, which requires the massing of combat power, is no longer possible because any massed force will be destroyed by indirect fires. And that this is highly complicated for maneuver warfare, that shallow attacks along the entire forward line of troops are most likely to be acceptable cost ratio. So shallow attacks, this chipping away. Attempts at deep penetration will be exposed to massed fires at the moment they exit the protection of that defensive bubble, which we continue talking about. After this, the second phase begins, the offensive attritional phase that I believe that we're in. Should be launched across a broad front, seeking to overwhelm the enemy at multiple points using shallow attacks. This is what we have been speaking about with Russia, I believe, at the moment, has 7, 8 different areas where they are making advancements. We'll look at that in a second, day here, but it's moving that force exactly like Alexander says here. The intent is to remain outside that layered bubble of friendly protective systems while stretching depleted enemy reserves until the front line collapses. We're about to speak about enemy reserves. There is a cascading effect in which a crisis in one sector forces the defenders to shift reserves from another sector, only to generate a crisis there in turn. As forces start falling back and leaving prepared fortifications, morale plummets. And we've spoken that this is what we believed we were seeing months ago, and it seems to line up with then the Washington Post article that we are then reading. So let's continue through this. A new push in the Donetsk region is interesting as it indicates there is a wider operational planning change. Meaningful advance was previously inhibited by Russian tactical blunders, and they've struggled to strategize in the last few years. Having previously thrown men at prolonged high casualty efforts, Russian operational commanders are now learning how to do simultaneous and mutual reinforcing offensive efforts and maintaining constant pressure on Ukrainian resources. Now, this is the pit where we'll speak about Soviet versus NATO doctrine and how the Russians are looking at that things are changing now on the front line of how then the Russians are operating. So the main difference in Soviet and NATO doctrine is the disposability of systems and of soldiers. And that's a terrible word to say when we're talking about men, but the Soviets, Russians will have far more, say, tanks, worse tanks, but so many of them. Same with shells, same with a lot of things. And that they are there more easily replaced and not as much of a hit as if they lose one. But for the ground effort, what we're talking about on the ground, the main difference in this disposability is the prevalence of a non-commissioned officer corps. Your junior commanders on the ground, your lance corporals, your corporals, your sergeants. Now, this allows NATO to do very technical maneuver warfare. But what many point at is in protracted war where you have very high losses and even close to equal losses on either side, that the Soviets may fight better the longer this goes on, and NATO might fight worse this goes on. Talking not about Soviets and NATO, but talking about the doctrine itself. Where the Soviets will have very large losses in the beginning, they gain experience on the ground, and it's more easily to replace those men due to the lack of experience, lack of NCO corps. But you can have more guys because less training means you'll have high losses. But on the flip side of this, NATO has an absolutely massive reliance on non-commissioned officers because they have much smaller forces, much more technical maneuver on the ground. Thing is, these NCOs take a very, very long time to train. And in an attritional war, protracted war, you're losing a heap of guys. If you lose that NCO corps, and our tactics are based on having really well-trained, proficient NCOs, other tactics can be very then hard to achieve. And this gives Russia a larger, more disposable force as it is then easier to replace men. And in a large losses prolonged period, NATO fighting capability can actually reduce over time because of the time it takes to get these guys to the level we need them to do our tactics. And because this is due to just the responsibility of the small team maneuver that we put on them from the wars we've been fighting more recently. So you need more highly trained and experienced leaders, where the Soviets can actually sustain much higher losses, and experience is gained on the battlefield through a lot of guys who survive the amount of time. And over amount of time, and we've spoken about the doctrine in this, over a few years, what we've seen in wars of the past is actually then a non-commissioned officer corps actually develops within the ranks of the Soviets. So you get the same thing, but it takes a hell of a long time and a hell of a lot of large losses. And that is one of the main areas of difference between NATO and Soviet ground doctrine. Now, it's far more in-depth than that, but just a quick overview. We are so reliant on NCOs. What works fantastically in highly technical maneuver asymmetric war, but suffering high losses is very, very hard. This we've actually seen Russia, say they've lost a few 100,000, we're not sure, but they're still able to actually sustain a battlefield and move through. And I've spoken at military things only recently and said, imagine if we lost 200, 300, 400, 500, 1,000 a day, we would have no capability. We might have soldiers, we might have diggers, but we're so reliant on these NCOs, the tactics we have would fall apart. And this is where many are looking at in what I read, this hybrid between the two and how we will need mobilisation and conscription and use some of that more long-term experience at the front to be supplemented by the experienced full-time soldiers in a protracted long war. So we'll continue, and I've got another piece on this though, but it's a bit different. It's about industry. Ukrainian commanders and soldiers interviewed by the Washington Post cited exhaustion and dwindling resources, including a severe lack of troops. A new mobilisation law adopted by Ukraine's parliament has yet to provide desperately needed reinforcements. This is what I do not understand. We know this law went through. We know it was very unpopular. We know at that time we were like, it needs to be next week. They need to call up these guys now, because you need at least that 12 months from that point to train, like a minimum if you want to launch an offensive next year. It hasn't been done, which is one of the main elements. I think either Ukraine's going to have less and less performance on the front line, or they're going to have some sort of negotiation if you're not willing to reinforce and mobilise, because that's what's desperate right now. Sergeant, who goes by the call sign Bart, described the situation as critical and said there was serious chaos on the front lines. Let's continue on this. Commanders and analysts said the purpose of fighting the Russian assaults on the nearby city of New York was to put pressure on Ukraine's fatigue infantry units with the aim of breaking through near Konstantinivka. Exactly what we've said. You put pressure somewhere and then you'll find it somewhere else. Of course, we're talking Toretsk in New York down here, going for Konstantinivka, moving resources around, pushing on many different fronts, shallow front lines at different times, causing chaos and then causing chaos as they have to move then troops away. Now, this bloke has said, what has changed tremendously, referring to the Russians, is their drone tactics and their use of electronic warfare. We used to have the upper hand and were more efficient, but now this is not the case. So I did this interview a bit over a month ago. Go and watch it. It was fully anonymous. It was through me. So we spoke on the phone. I could take notes and then I had to present it. Speak exactly on these points of the used to have the upper hand of drones and of EW. And that has quickly changed. And this guy in here points out several very simple things that Ukraine should do on the front. He's incredibly experienced. He's been there since the start and has a background in a very experienced location. He said, if you fix this stuff, it would be cheap. It's very doable. It would really cause a change on the front. Interesting to look at, and that it's being reiterated now by this then article. Now, they're using New York to encircle Toretsk. I think they have a real chance of encircling it. It's just a question of resources and timing. Pasha said the glide bombs are so powerful they can incapacitate entire infantry units with concussions. And we know, of course, there's a huge psychological effect of then those glide bombs as well, of course, doing this. So it touches on a few things that we have touched on before and sort of reiterates things that I'm not just talking out my arse. But speaking on that doctrine, prolonged attritional warfare and where things may sit, and that nothing is perfect, but how we can't be too set in stone of exact tactics and strategy. This is my same opinion on why China and Russia's non-privatized industrial capacity in a large conventional protracted war could actually be a more robust system than the multi-billion, trillion-dollar military-industrial complex that we have. And stick with me for a second. I'm not saying that it's more ethical or moral or creates better systems. I'm saying the opposite of that. But it can produce a heap of shit because it makes less technologically advanced weapons. But as we have seen, as we are seeing, the amount of just cheap shells, equipment that it can actually pump out is unbelievable. That Russia is outdoing the entire West by 3 to 6 times on shells. So is North Korea, and China would be more so than that again because it's non-privatized. Now, I fully believe in private, free, open markets, but to produce shells and non-R&D heavy technical weapons, a private system may not work for this. And this is what one of my friends sent me across about protracted war and the US military-industrial complex. The American military-industrial complex prefers short-term conflicts or peacetime operations. The idea and reasoning behind this is long-term conflict redirects fundings towards consumable items and operational cost, things like ammunition, fuel, gunpowder, and wages. These have a much lower profit margin compared to the higher margin research and development projects and advanced weapon developments. And in short-term peacetime operation, we get that high-margin R&D project. In prolonged war, the money goes into fuel, food, ammo, wages, gunpowder. And of course, that doesn't have the margin or the amount of companies competing for this either. Of course, you get less technologically advanced weapons, but what are we seeing that Ukraine needs on the front? They don't need, on the whole, the most tech-advanced weapons. It's like, we just need more shells. We just need more men. And this is those systems in protracted war. And I think we need to look at this and learn from it. As we are seeing things coming to that we've predicted 6, 8, 12 months ago that could come into play. Now, like I've been speaking about a lot, there's a lot of messaging around this November peace plan, and there's all these things that sort of line up with Ukraine talking about with Turkey ways to get people out of occupied territories, to not mobilizing, and a lot of this, and looking to invite Russia to this, meetings with China, meetings with India. It seems like there may be something. Now, this is with Zelensky with Japanese news. Zelensky said, peace, support, diplomatic pressure are the three factors for a just end to the war. And if the US and European nations maintain unity, it will be added pressure to show Moscow that there is no chance. I don't think it's the only factors. I think the other factor for Ukraine's goals now is the 91 borders, if that is still the goal, which I think publicly it might be. I think behind closed doors it might not be, but it's also military victory. It has to be. That the US and European nations, they've got unity, basically, realistically. Beyond that, Ukraine need victories on the front line to retake that and also improve the morale crisis that is occurring too. Zelensky has stressed that he cannot respond to calls for a ceasefire while Russia continues to occupy Ukrainian territory. The president said Kyiv will start a detailed discussions with relevant countries on territorial integrity and other issues. He said that he will create an action plan for peace by the end of November. Now, Zelensky also touched on former US President Donald Trump, who is reportedly not keen on supporting the country. I didn't say that. He said he's supporting peace and an end to the war. The US presidential election in November is expected to have significant impact on Ukraine's hopes for peace. That said, I've actually been thinking about this, that a Trump presidency could actually be a bit of an off-ramp for Kyiv and Zelensky, that we've spoken about, that with all the messaging, we need this border, nothing but this, blah, blah, blah. It's very hard for the Ukrainian government to turn that back, even if that becomes unobtainable. That if Trump gets in, you can shift something like, well, it's because of this we had to then do X, which I agree with, but it may actually be a bit of an off-ramp there as well. So let's have a look at the maps before we then talk about the F-16. So here's Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, purple since 14, and the red check areas that have been made within then the last 24 hours. And we come down to where we will look first, and Donetsk, Avdiivka front. And what we can see here are further gains around Osharetne, expanding control out to Vesely, out near Zeleny, as well as out towards then this intersection, which we believe will be very critical in the coming days and or weeks. But again, expanding this control from Osharetne then out towards Pokrovsk in this direction. So let's then have a look at the maps and then see what this is saying. So zoom in on here. Again, same changes. Vesely shown here. Doesn't show this up here, but again, the amount that is shown on this map today meets basically the amount that was shown then on latter days on the Syriac maps. So we can confirm that those changes then took place. Now, we'll just come down to the south, because then Krasnoyarivka, we get another update here. Krasnoyarivka, this in the center, that Syriac was showing more control just in this north than this map, and then this has updated today. Now, on the deep state map, that is the last remaining updates that it shows for today, but Syriac does show a few others. So let's just come to the north of Avdiivka and we'll look at Toretsk, New York, Konstantinivka front. So right in here, it shows more filling out of control between Zelezny and then Druzhba in here too. So pushing up then against this road. Now, this is showing outside of even what the grey zone is shown on here, but we do know this is an area where Russia is pushing fairly hard. Russia continue advancing in Zelezny, taking control over a series of buildings south of this avenue. Meanwhile, in the Pivnevsky, Russian forces took full control over this street. So they are making movements in here, then according to Syriac maps. Now, let's just move down to the south of here, as there is an important update if then confirmed, and I can't see a geolocation of this or on this map, but we will talk about it. So what this is then showing is that Russia has made an advancement then towards this road, which we know this road is very critical for supply between Vuhledar and Konstantinivka. Again, we don't know exactly where the front line actually sits in here. There's some very different reporting. But here we go. Another access was opened by the Russian army in order to reach this road. So saying that they've opened then an access just along where my cursor is here, pushing down these tree lines in an attempt to get to this road and then cut it off. Wait and see if that is then confirmed over the next coming days. Now, Chasiv Yar, Bakhmut front. Let's have a look as Syriac has an update here. Now, this is an important update. Russian army was able to consolidate a bridgehead west of the canal by seizing the first houses on this street and this district and positions around the radio station of the Novi district. Now, again, grain of salt, not shown on both maps, but what we have said, the hardest part about the operation in here is going to be crossing this canal. Open ground, very difficult to cross. How will it be done? Well, we weren't sure. By Syriac's map, it is showing that Russia has made that control and has made a large bridgehead through here. By his map, as I always say, grain of salt, wait for multiple confirmations and or geolocations to be shown. But if the Ukrainian map show that Russian advancement, I'm pretty confident in believing it. So let's come right up into the north. Nothing has changed up here for a long time. This disconnect, it's not going to be, there might be grey zone in between here, but as far as that these guys are trapped out here, like Forbes and whatever was reporting that there's 400 guys encircled in here, there's no way. It's been like a month and a half now. But let's then have a look at this. And this is more what I believe it would be looking like. That yes, it's very thin. It may even be grey at times, but there's still going to be some level of logistical support there. But Ukraine has made advancements in here where they're on the offensive. On the Shuv axis, the Battle of Volchansk continue. During the last 4 days, the Ukrainian army managed to recapture Stepova streets and the northeastern part of the town on some positions on the Soborna street and adjacent to this central market. See, nothing is showing and updating on this map, nor does it show that Russia has actually crossed then the Vovcha River here. So again, beats me of what is exactly happening on this front. But time will tell, and if the war does end and there is a new border drawn up, we will then know exactly where the front line sits. So, F-16s. I have said the F-16s, I think the morale boost of them coming in will be great. But if they don't perform, they're incredibly expensive, take an incredible amount of time, and it could have then a propaganda backfire as well, as it's been really hammered home. You think the Leopards and the Abrams were talked up as a game changer. This has been unbelievably higher than that. And we've also spoken in the numbers and the increasing performance of the Russian Air Force, which was their biggest failure in this entire conflict. If you were to point at which one has failed the most out of Russia, Navy, Air Force, Army, you can point at failures in all. The Air Force especially should have been where the overmatch was unbelievably high, especially in those early days, and completely failed to get a stranglehold on what was needed. But I have heard people talk of, yes, but we are basing that off how we thought we would see it. And someone wrote that we don't have any other example of modern fighter aircraft entering into a war zone with really good air defense and massive saturation of man pads and how that actually looks. So someone said it is pretty rough to judge, and we haven't actually had any other example of that yet. So I'll leave that with you to see. But I still think the Overmatch should have performed significantly better. And I think most would agree on that. But this was from Washington Post actually as well. Long-awaited F-16 jets are set to be flying in Ukraine within weeks. I've heard that for months. But Ukraine and Western officials now caution the aircraft, once championed by Kyiv as a game-changer, are unlikely to make immediate impact on the battlefield. The F-16s will likely serve to boost Ukrainians' air defences to shoot down aerial targets as missiles, drones and aircraft, rather than strike Russia's invading ground forces. So another AD asset. What America said in the beginning was you need air defence, not then a flying air defence of a plane, which we agreed with at the time, and now it's looking like that, at least to gain experience before they go to the front. Officials have said that the planes, at least initially, are unlikely to fly too close to the frontline fighting, meaning it is unclear they will even be able to deter attacking enemy aircraft from crossing into Ukraine from Russian airspace. Again, this is what the F-16s need to do. They don't need to be there to shoot down missiles in the air. Yes, it's handy, but they need to be hitting the planes launching the missiles. Now, the long-range strategic bombers are going to be way too far back fighting cruise missiles. Regardless of what we strap on the F-16, it's just going to be too far back. But what is causing the havoc at the front line, like we spoke about in the article before with the commander, is the glide bombs at the front. The glide bombs, the cost versus reward of hitting the glide bombs in the air, you need to hit the Su-34s dropping them. That said, they're dropping them 30, 40, 50, 60 Ks behind the line, depending if they're the ones with the little engine on them. If these can't go there near the front, you're getting a long, long way away. Anyway, here we go. Belgium, Denmark, Netherlands and Norway have pledged to provide with 80 F-16s, but most of those won't arrive for years. Officials decline to say how many jets Kyiv will receive, but it won't be more than a squadron, which is 20 jets. And just 6 pilots were projected to complete training by this summer because the program has limited spots and marred by delays. There's been a lot of problems with then language, because everything's in English, of course, and how difficult these actually are to fly. It's like taking me driving my Mitsubishi around and strap me in a bloody F1 car. It's a massive change to be able to then head into the most contested airspace with modern weapons that we've ever seen. What links into that first part of how did the performance actually go. Ukrainian officials, however, respond with a familiar refrain. With F-16s, as with other material, the West has supplied too little, too late. The F-16, the supply of the aircraft is an issue, but the training, the amount of time it takes to train is a huge problem too. What I said, at least a year and a half ago, was anything needs to start now to do that. And we've seen articles recently about, Ukraine want to acquire Australia's old assault helicopters, attack helicopters, the Tigers, when we get rid of them. But I'm like, yeah, okay, but that's going to take years of training before they're in the air too, 26, 27, 28. How will the war look then if Russia continue this successful grind forwards? Volodymyr Zelensky has said Ukraine needs more than 100 F-16s to combat Russia's huge air force and has called the quantity of jets Ukraine is receiving insufficient. That said, you'd need with this approximately 200 pilots. That is going to be just as big of an issue as the aircraft, mixed with how many ground crew you're going to have as well. And like that, if you watch the interview I linked before in this video, the guy said, we don't need Abrams, we don't need F-16s, we need a thermal sight every couple hundred metres on the front line, and we need these guys with decent night vision and boots. That's what will make a difference, not this. The decision on the F-16 is strategic. The number is not yet strategic. Some analysts are even more sceptical than Zelensky. Said the F-16s might be most potent as a psychological and morale boost for Ukrainians and effective for Russian conscripts. It will be, but if they don't perform well and there's no change seen, it could have the opposite on both. It could be a massive push for the Russians and use for their informational propaganda space, and a reduction already on the psychological morale that Ukraine is having as well. I think these are a big risk, and I think the Twitter accounts, whatever, have blown this out of the water, the proportion of what Ukraine is actually receiving and what it may be. The way people are talking these up And I know people go, no, yes, they are. The way people are talking about F-16s is if America said we're supplying Ukraine with 200 F-22s. That's how people have been talking this up. Same with the Abrams. People go, no, we've always said the Abrams were the older models and not going to make a difference. But no, you didn't. Go back through people's... It was they're going to roll across to Crimea and we're having the beach party. So I think it is dangerous that overhyping the guys who aren't on the front, who are sitting on Twitter, are making... that affects the people actually doing the work. We've seen this pretty routine pattern when it comes to Western military equipment for Ukraine. There is an immediate need for them. Often by the time they're delivered, that immediate operational need is null and void based on the rate of battlefield adaptation. And we've seen this with a lot of weapon system, that the adaptation on the other side, which people don't think that Russia can adapt, which they obviously can, as we are seeing, that now they're not needed. We've spoken about articles very similar to this before. Now, the main restriction is the amount of planes and the time of training. If Russia has 300 fighters and you have much less, you can't operate properly. We will not use it too close to the Russians due to their threat of air defences. Again, pushing back and back, limiting probably the use on then the bombers you need to hit, which are mostly then the Su-34s. While the F-16 offers an improvement over Ukraine's existing jets, it is still an older generational fighter compared to Russia's newer, more sophisticated air force, which is true. Like it or not, that is true. There's more of them. The planes are more sophisticated, and I will say the pilots have a hell of a lot of experience now as well. Huge losses in the beginning, but we've seen that very taper off. The absolute majority of Russian aircraft that have been hit in the past year have not been airborne. They've been then on the ground. Ukraine's military intelligence directorate previously reported that Moscow has more than 200 fighters. And I would pump that number well over that, depending on what aircraft you take into account. But I believe it's much higher than that. As Ukraine's air defences have weakened in recent months, especially near the front, the Russians have flexed their air power in riskier combat missions. And one of the most destructive weapons Russia uses the guided glide bombs. When was the last time we had a confirmed Su-34 actually shot down at the front in large numbers compared to the amount that Sukhoi are managing to make? And we've looked at these new ones rolling off and the amount confirmed hit. And we're going, well, it's pretty close parity, and they've still got a heap of them in service. One crashed, I think, yesterday or the day before. Anyway, it's nearly impossible for Ukraine forces to shoot down once launched. The only solution is to target the aircraft. The F-16 could scare some Russian aircraft into not getting too close and dropping the bombs. I think we'll see this initially until we see what the restrictions actually are. I'm not meaning Western restrictions. I'm meaning where they're willing to fly and lose them. Because if you're in range of them, if they're in range of you, they're in range of. If they're in range of you, you're in range of them. And the last thing Ukraine want is day 1 or 2 an F-16 coming down. Now, here, defenders of the plan, so that will help even the scales with Russia, which has used close air support to advance in Ukraine. Now, this is something that I vehemently disagree with, of close air support. When you can actually call in close air support from overhead, that gives you a significant advantage and an ability to actually move a battle line, a battlefront forward. I can't see... You could prove me wrong here. I can't see in the next years an F-16 using what I would consider close fire support for forces. What I'm calling close fire support is not a missile from 100 k's, but I'm talking the gun on the front, unguided bombs, like actual close fire, like supporting that frontline element moving like we would see an A-10 work in Afghan. We've seen that occasionally with Su-25s and Russia using that. We've seen that actually recently. We see the LMPUR, I think they're called, being used by the Kar-52 choppers actually down in Uglada, where we spoke about down in here. A Ukrainian page shared them actually working in here, which was interesting. But as far as what I would call close fire support, an F-16 is not a great aircraft to do that compared to a much slower moving aircraft like, say, an A-10 or a Su-25. But it depends, I guess, on what you're putting it. But so the arrival of the aircraft certainly gives Ukraine more capability. But the closeness of that to be in there, it's bloody dangerous. A senior Defense Department official has said that the training pipeline is pretty meagre, that there were other priorities, and more recently, there wouldn't be enough pilots to support and use the plane effectively from the US. And the US has never really been very enthusiastic about this. This bloke who was in the Thunderbirds, which fly F-16s, about 90 of the 130-person team are just maintenance crew for then 8 jets. And these are stripped down as well, so could be more than that. Gives an idea of how many ground crew there might be. But he says, I think people are waiting for this climactic moment of the jets to arrive and everything shifts. And it just doesn't work like that. They're complicated, they're complex to support and operate. It's exciting, but we have to be a little, oh my God, hiccups. But we have to be a little bit patient and see the results. There is a chance F-16s will follow the path of the US-provided Abrams, which arrived in a limited number, arrival conditions, and change, and had a debatable impact on last year's counteroffensive. I don't think it's debatable. Last year's counteroffensive, they had zero impact. The first time we saw Abrams working was around Avdiivka, which the impact then, I guess you could claim, was debatable, but I think most people would be on the side of the debate that it made no real change except for a lot of Russian propaganda. And rather than 30 Abrams, you would have been better off with 60 other variants of something else, because the risk of losing them was so high too. And a lot of reports that they were moved back out of like the front due to the propaganda victory that Russia was having them. And I spoke about this the other day. What is more effective on the front line, not tactically, strategically? Does the battlefield tactic ability of an Abrams outweigh the strategic victory of if it goes down? I'd put F-16s very similarly to this. And it's sort of confirming things we've spoken about. Sorry, guys, this one was way longer than I was hoping. Have a fantastic day. Look after yourselves, and I'll speak to you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.